And we're joined now by Jamie Neugebauer. Jamie is well known in sports circles. He's the voice of the Junior A hockey club, the Notre Dame Hounds, works with that hockey team, also does work with athletic teams at the University of Regina. But a lot of people don't know about this, and that is you are, I guess you could say a historian, not quite. Your education, though, is based in history. I guess I'll let you kind of explain what your background is, Jamie.
Yeah, well, I got interested in history at a young age. My dad was always reading, and so he would kind of teach me. And then, yeah, self-educated for a while, and then did my undergrad at Wilfrid Laurier University in Waterloo in history. Got a degree and focused a lot on, yeah, like early modern Europe and Canadian history and American history. I've really done a lot of personal reading on American history. But yeah, the Napoleonic Wars, the War of 1812, 19th century, just in a sort of big snapshot, Europe and North America certainly are the areas of my biggest interest.
Now, of course, this past little bit, we've been on the podcast looking at the War of 1812. And one of the big thing that a lot of people always wonder about is the causes, because here you are,
Mhm.
30 years after the Revolutionary War, and the United States declares war on Britain again. And there's so many myriad of cases. I know in school here in Canada, we're kind of taught it's the Americans wanted to conquer Canada, but
Mm.
there was so much more to it than that. What's your take on kind of why the
Mhm.
Americans would put themselves in that situation?
Yeah, so like the thing that I've the exercise that I find interesting about doing this is how in depth to go, or how when I'll tune people will tune out. So there's the very basic, the propaganda that the American government will say would want people to know, that they just kind of throw out there. And a quick answer is that the Americans felt like the British. Of course, you remember the Americans just got their independence not too long before this. The Americans felt like the British weren't respecting American independence, and how that was manifesting itself in a large way was that the British Navy, which was 1,000 ships worldwide in this conflict with Napoleon and the French in Europe, needed every sailor and every man and every spare dollar that they could find. And they weren't respecting American independence, like Americans would say, by stopping American ships, searching them, and trying to find deserted British sailors on American ships. And in a lot of cases they were right to do so, I suppose you could say, because there were a lot of British deserters from the Royal Navy, because the British Navy was very, very good in the way that it went about its business. It was very successful, we'll say, but it was also very, very harsh. There was a lot of discipline. There was a lot of whipping. It was really hard. The American Navy, on the flip side, not the same level of discipline. Not as hard. Probably got paid more on time, and all that. So that all being said, the Americans were very upset that the British were, were impressing these sailors back into the British Navy. And sometimes they were, British runaways, and sometimes the British were like, well, what's citizenship anyways? We need some sailors, so we don't care that you're an American, because you think this day and age, with the American armed forces being as big and as powerful as it is, back then, it's not the same story whatsoever. And I think one of the points that you like to make, Stephen, is that the Americans, and we'll get to this, were not prepared at all for a war when they started the War of 1812. So what I like to say is that's what the Americans were saying, is that the British um, weren't respecting their sovereignty. They also felt like it was just a perfect time, and I like to say it was a perfect time for the Americans to invade Canada and invade British territory, because the British were so busy and so well spread out around the world. It was really a world war. And then on the flip side, it was also a terrible time for the Americans to do it, because the Americans were not prepared. So it was just kind of two sides that were in a bit of a mess at the same time. So the Americans would say that. They would also say that the ruling party in the States at the time was a party called the Democratic Republican Party. And it was run by James Madison, who is good friends with Thomas Jefferson, who was, of course, the president for a while before. and famously wrote the Declaration of Independence. But the thing about the Democratic Republican Party, which is, I believe, today the Republican Party, is that they were mostly Southern based. They were mostly agricultural based. They, basically what they wanted was land. They wanted space. They wanted space to spread out. They were not very fond of natives. They were pretty pro-slavery. What does Canada have, Steve?
Yeah, oh, exactly. We got so much space and room and
lots of room. So,
but and it's interesting that you bring up that the whole thing about them not being prepared, because like you take a look at the very outsets of the first battle, so to speak, Fort Mackinac. Not a single shot fired, and the British take it because when the commanding officer of an American fort has to find out from the attackers that they're at war. Like that's like, I know communication was bad in the early 1800s, but that's kind of really lacking.
Yeah. Hey, these are big territories we're talking. There's no Telegram, there's no Twitter. So these kind of things happened, especially in a frontier sort of space. I mean, the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 80 to 1756 to 1763 in Europe started in 1754, really, because an American colonel named George Washington kind of started a fight with some French in the Ohio Valley, and the French didn't have any idea that there was a war going on either. So this kind of thing has happened in the history of North American conflict, had happened for many, many years. Certainly American communications were poor, and a big part of that too, Steve, and you talk about the Americans going to war. There has been no war in the history of the United States that was less popular in its Congress, less popularly voted in the Congress than the War of 1812. There were more people who were opposed to this war all over the US than in any other war ever. So it was really a country that was kind of dragged to war more than anything. And so there were lots of people in the States that not only did they not know that they were at war with Britain, but they would never in a million years want to be at war with the British, because, you think about the parties and you talk, these really are the wealthy, right? We're talking about the upper echelon that care about politics. The Democratic Republican Party, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, who's in power at the time of the War of 1812, their rivals are the Federalist Party, and they're very pro-British, and led by, I don't know if anybody's seen that Lin-Manuel Miranda musical, Alexander Hamilton. That's kind of the beginning of the Federalist Party in a lot of ways, but they were very pro-British. They were very pro-trade with Britain. So why on the world would you start a war with this country that you are very, very reliant on? So there were Federalists everywhere, including, and I think you want to talk about the Battle of Queenston Heights. The American general at the Battle of Queenston Heights, General Van Rensselaer, is a big time Federalist and doesn't, have anything against the British. If anything, the British have put a lot of money in his pocket. So it's kind of funny how all over the place the Americans were. So certainly, to your point, the success that the British had, Sir Isaac Brock using the terror, and I don't think people will understand how afraid the Americans were of the First Nations, because they were treated horribly. The First Nations were just treated terribly by the Americans and the British for the most part too. But the Americans were considered to be considerably worse. And, the lead up to the war, one of the other reasons why the war started, to continue the point about the First Nations, Stephen, is that the Americans flat out thought the British were inciting First Nations rebellion against the Americans as the Americans continued to expand westward, looking for that space, as we were talking about, that the Americans wanted, right? So that's it. That sort of psychological warfare was certainly one that was a big, especially at the beginning of the war, for Sir Isaac Brock, the commander of the British forces.
Well, yeah, and we'll go back to the whole Federalist thing. Like there was the large Federalist contingent in New England. Like they were looking to threaten to even succeed. Now, mind you, part of that comes from the Henry letters, which the veracity of those I know is still debated to this day. But it's the fact that there was all that espionage happening from a guy from Montreal who turned out to a con man who ended up getting conned, but managed to kind of push that towards, especially with giving it to Madison, which I don't know if that helped or hindered his push for war, because it turns out that none of what, or most of what he had said was false about the succession movement in New England. But what do you think? Like, would New England have succeeded if given the right push during the War of 1812?
You mean to secede from the Union?
Yeah, succeed from the Union.
Yeah, I mean, again, like we think about the USA as it is today. When we read these things, we think about these things. We read books and articles. The Americans, the United States, da da da. It was so ununited, like it was crazy. And I read a really good book not too long ago called the I think it was called The American Civil War of 1812. Basically, that there were all sorts of plots and all sorts of things that almost happened where different parts of the states, including New England, who was heavily Federalist, wanted to separate from the Union and maybe rejoin Britain and or make its own state. Like these were situations that really, because the American Revolution and the Constitution left out all sorts of things in the interest of expediency, in the interest of unity, attempted unity between all these different former colonies that were very, very independent, very, very distinctive. Anything could have happened, really. Like, and in some ways, looking back in hindsight about the War of 1812, commentators, especially American ones, will call the War of 1812 the second U.S. War of Independence, simply because there's nothing that brings Americans together like a war. And the fact that they were able to actually put forces in the field and fight was never something that was a certainty until it actually happened. And even once it was happening, it was all up in the air. So it was a shambles sort of from the start from the Americans. And it certainly any sort of plot that you read that could have happened, it could have. Like, there was nothing set in stone about the survival of the United States at this point.
Well, I think it was Stacy who said the Americans were happy because they whipped the British. The Canadians were happy because they whipped the Americans, and the British were happy because they didn't even know what happened.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's like to fast forward, right? I mean, to the treaty that ends the war. But hey, again, like you gotta look at everything in all the different angles, and certainly one of them is that there's many ways to look at this war.
Yeah. Well, and you kind of touched on First Nations and the role that Indigenous warriors played throughout this war. As you said, there was that shock value of the fear, and that played a really big role in kind of the very beginnings, as we talked about Fort Mackinac, and then just south of there in Detroit. Once again, deception, fear tactics, all playing a role in how Brock was able to take over Detroit with very minimal shots being fired.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And a big part of this is, the commander of the British forces, Isaac Brock, is a career soldier. He's a real soldier. He's a guy who's eager to fight. He's a guy that's worked hard and studied, and he really wanted to leave North America because the Napoleonic Wars were happening in Europe and he wanted to get into the action. The guys he's facing, like the governor of Michigan and the governor of New York, Governor Hall in Michigan, and Tompkins in New York, and Van Rensselaer, who we talk about there in Queenston Heights. These are not soldiers. Like, these are politicians. These could be you and me, Steve. Like, it's like people watch a hockey game. Like, oh, I could coach. Like, no, you couldn't. Like, you don't know what's going on like down there. So these are just kind of politicians, and the Americans pick different spots and different people in positions because of political, more than who's the best at the job, especially in a war. So the of course what kind of goes on is a lot of war by psychological means, by sending letters. Isaac Brock says, and this is in the context of many different conflicts, of lots of massacres and lots of violence. And there was a revolt in Michigan in the 1790s that that there was just widespread massacres. So this is really fresh in the minds of of, of all the Americans and the militia, especially, and the regular soldiers, if you want to call them regulars, very poorly disciplined American professional soldiers, if you want to call them that as well. So, the basically Isaac Brock comes with a much smaller army and his First Nations allies, and Isaac Brock writes a letter to the commander of the American forces and says, we could fight, but like if we win, I can't really control my native warriors. Like once it starts, like, probably, Tecumseh, who was the leader of the First Nations, would have listened to, British control, Isaac Brock's control, if there was actually a fight for Detroit and for Michigan. But that was enough, and a big part of it too, Steve, is the American commanders. There's a real theme. A lot of them, you think about the 1813 expedition up to Quebec, which is maybe where the Americans should have gone in the first place. But that's a story for another time. Is that all these guys are big time boozers. and so like Hall and Wilkinson and Van Rensselaer, they're all just boozing, and then you get this letter, and your nerves are already frayed. And the British general says, I can't control the First Nations. If we win, you're gonna get all killed, and it's gonna be horrible, and your women and children won't be safe. And essentially, he loses his nerve, right? And it's easy to look back on him, on history, and say he was a buffoon, but these all things are very real and very fresh. Like First Nations, in a lot of ways, and especially Tecumseh's men, were considered kind of the boogeymen by these American soldiers. So there's all these factors, and clearly the aggressiveness of Brock paid off, and clearly the psychological warfare of Brock paid off.
Well, that's like the psychological warfare is the big factor there, because you have Prevost telling Brock that no, we're going to fight a defensive war. We don't have the manpower. Brock sitting there going, do you not see how quickly and easily we took Detroit? Just let me go. I can have this whole thing over in 6 months almost. Is kind of that mentality that he would have had with how easy he was able to fend them off with just psychological warfare, doing something, straight out of Looney Tunes, having a guy march past the picket and then run around out of sight and march past the picket again, just to make it look like that they've got more men than what they have. Like, it worked, but you don't like it's tactics that almost seem like ahead of their time. Like to be able to kind of put that in there. Like, yes, there's the psychological warfare of all battles, but it seems like Brock was kind of a little bit more of a thinker than what most people would even give credit for in any army, considering that to be an officer in the British Army at the time, you had to buy your way in. So you did end up with quite a bit of idiots who were officers in that time frame, but Brock was the genuine thing.
Yeah, certainly there's a level of buffoonery that exists in the British Army. That's clear, but you get competence too, right? And again, Brock is a professional at what he's doing here. And in Prevost's, I guess, defense, if you want to look at it that way, Isaac Brock along the Niagara Peninsula had 1,200 British regulars. The Americans could call on, thousands upon thousands upon thousands. He had a very small unit size of men. And so if you look at it in pure numbers, and I mentioned, this is probably the best time for the Americans to attack because the British government was not sparing a lot of troops for defending Canada. So it's like, well, here, do with this what you can, Isaac Brock and George Prevost, and Prevost, being a little bit nervous and not really a professional soldier himself, and Brock is, Brock is again aggressive, and he said to Prevost, give me the freedom and I'll wipe them all the way, down to where he said Washington or something, like, if you just let me attack. And the aggressiveness pays off. And again, you're dealing with guys that don't really know what they're talking about in these American commanders against a guy who, you're right, there were some guys in the British Army that were paid in and bought in, but Brock was a guy that was, from a Channel Island, not from the mainland. He was, a younger son, nobility, but not like major nobility. he was in Canada. Like
Yeah.
he wasn't in like at the same time as this, the Duke of Wellington's forces, the big British army, the big British push, all the glory is going on in Spain right now. I mean, for context, like they're fighting the French back in Spain, in the Iberian Peninsula, and fighting big battles there at the same time, and that's where the glory is happening. That's where a small-time guy, like a small Irish guy named Arthur Wellesley, becomes a hero at the Battle of Talavera in 1809, and goes on to become the Duke of Wellington, and becomes famous in the prime minister. And Brock is in some backwater outpost that nobody'd heard of. Canada is nothing. So he had ambition, is my point.
Yeah.
And so he found a way.
I was going to say, if people want to ever, the Sharp books by Bernard Cornwell, great telling of the Peninsular War.
Yeah, exactly.
Now we've mentioned Queenston Heights a few times, and as you said, it's perhaps the Americans should have made a push into Lower Canada as opposed to Upper Canada, but really the Americans, if there hadn't been infighting, they very well could have taken Queenston Heights. That's for me looking at it, because you have Smith, who absolutely refuses, flat out does everything he can to barely make it away from not getting court-martialed for insubordination. The regular officer who's having to listen to this militia guy, Van Rensselaer. And if it wasn't for Smith really being a dick, to be the only way to describe it, apologies for younger listeners, but if it wasn't for Smith, doing that, they would have had enough forces that when they crossed over at Queenston, I think it very well could have changed the entire flow of the battle.
Yeah, I mean, I think the numbers, if you look at overall numbers, just the amount of Americans on the American side of the Niagara River, if you're not aware of the geography, there's a couple points at which the Niagara Peninsula, the part of Ontario that dips into the States, connects, and along the Niagara Peninsula is sort of one of them. It doesn't connect fully by land. You have to cross the Niagara River, but it's a lot smaller than a Great Lake, right? Because there's the Great Lakes all around. So go look at a map if you're interested. But so Isaac Brock had about 1,000, maybe 1,200 men. About half of them were regular troops. The other half were militia and First Nations. And Van Rensselaer had about 5-6 times that number. So if you look at pure numbers, you're right, Stephen. Like, they could have just kind of swamped them probably if they were able to figure it out. But I mean, the morale was so low. Like, they had gathered this number, on the American side around Lewiston, New York, and just tried to gather this army until Van Rensselaer was comfortable to cross the river, first of all. And they sat there in the fall of 1812, and they sat there. And when you have, soldiers and an army sitting around doing nothing for a long time, it's never good news. Again, the boozing and the weather was horrible. The rain was bad. Everybody was soaking wet. Whose boats were, who was responsible for rowing the boats, who was responsible for bringing the boats at the right time. It was just all over the place. So certainly if it was just sort of a land walk across with 5,000 men, you have that. And then, of course, the famous thing that happens, once the battle starts is, first of all, there's an attempt to cross that's aborted because one of the one boat that had all the oars for the Americans to cross the river in October of 1812, that boat was missing, so they couldn't find their oars. And then they got oars, and then the regulars crossed the river. So the 2,000 or so American regulars crossed the river. And even then you think, okay, like 2,000 plus against 1,000, and half of them are militia and First Nations. You'd think, again, the Americans would have the opportunity there. But then that famous moment, right, where the militia refused to cross the river when the fighting's already started. So it's not exactly like a video game, right? Like, it's not just like you click on the troops and move them across, or like a board game. It's and just the last thing I'll say is, the values instilled in the average American from the Revolution is, nobility, aristocracy doesn't mean anything. Everything should be elected on, everything needs to be democratic, and everything needs to be what's best for me. And go into that deeply. People have written long books about this sort of mindset that the Americans had. It's not necessarily conducive to a good soldier at this time,
Yeah.
right? It's conducive to maybe an interesting thinker, maybe a conversation, but not necessarily, do as you're told right now. Don't care if it's raining. Don't care if there's natives. Don't care if the British are on the high ground and whatnot. So the Americans do cross, the regulars cross, the militia don't. But anyways, I don't know if you want to continue the story from there.
Well, I was going to say, it's one of the reasons why, going back to the psychological warfare thing, is part of the reason why the militia didn't cross or was reluctant to cross. And some of the things that I've read is the actual heights themselves were, went back and forth between control. And one of the last times when the British took control of the heights, they were like whooping like war cries, like the Mohawk warriors had been doing and they heard that on the other side of the river, and they were like, no. The British now have thousands of Mohawk. Meanwhile, there was like you said, maybe about 200-300 at most. And so the psychological warfare, and it really goes to show, like, how easily broken the morale was of the American soldiers.
Yeah, and you know what? I've been to Queenston Heights, and it's quite a thing to scale. Like it's quite steep, and it was even more wooded back then. So, the famous line from Congress when they were trying to talk about get the war going is that taking Canada would be so easy, it would just be a mere matter of marching. That's what the American politicians who were on the side of the war said. It would be super easy. But then you get on the ground, and it's actually a lot harder, and it looks a lot more daunting. So the heights of Queenston, and then of course there's the thing that is interesting, that again, you talk about how many men, but there's also the matter of artillery. And it wasn't like the Americans had a lot of artillery with which to dislodge, like cannons, to dislodge people from the heights. So, the matter of the British being on those heights is a great equalizer of numbers too. But, if you're not aware of what militia is, we're not talking about, yahoos with Confederate flags, drinking beer in Tennessee. Like, we're talking about peasants, farmers, bankers, lawyers, accountants, whatever, who sign up once in a while to serve their country. It's a very like part-time kind of thing, not a lot of training and not a lot of discipline, not a lot of good arming, not a lot of just training in general psychologically either. So it's a big difference between a militiaman as well and a regular. So yeah, the Americans had big numbers, but the British had some big advantages at the Battle of Queenston Heights too. Most importantly was Brock, of course.
Yeah, and but of course the militia, I'd say, they were the people who had weapons to serve as part of a well-regulated militia. The whole purpose of the U.S. Second Amendment was to provide for them. And it's you just have when you're the average person. Like I said, I can't picture myself marching into battle in modern day, let alone in 1800s, when a gunshot wound to the arm would be just as fatal as one to the chest.
Yeah, I mean, certainly to the medical practices of the time that were pretty substandard. And also there's just the matter of like we have movies, we have some we don't have really an understanding what it's like to be in war. We don't at all.
No.
But we have a little bit more than the people at the time would have, like the entertainment and whatever of the time. Like people just had no idea like what they were getting into. Like they had newspapers and pamphlets and stories of atrocities, of massacres and the quote unquote savage natives and everything. And these just things played on their mind. Like the level of education, the level of understanding of what they were getting into was almost nil. So usually the human response in that situation is to freeze, and to freeze is to not be, reliable soldiers. So, you're right. Like I wouldn't have wanted to cross that river either. So then they didn't. So there you go.
Well, Jamie, we're going to run out of time here this afternoon, but in a few weeks' time, we'll touch base again and chat maybe about the things like the 1813 push into Lower Canada, Battle of Chateauguay, and maybe even in a few more weeks after that, the Battle of Bladesburg and the burning of Washington, as we dispel the myth that Canadians marched valiantly from York down to Washington. So as much as we all love
Well,
to believe that myth.
I should say that the Battle of Queenston Heights was a big failure by the Americans. A lot of American soldiers had to surrender and whatever, because the boat, like the militia, wouldn't send the boats either. They wouldn't cross to help the regulars,
Yeah.
and they wouldn't help. They wouldn't send the boats back either to fetch them as they were falling back from losing the fight. But the big thing that happened, for if you're an American, that you should be happy about, I guess, in a weird way, is that Isaac Brock was killed at the Battle of Queenston Heights, the great commander of the British, Canadian First Nations defense, as he was leading a charge by himself. Bizarre to think of a general in this day and age. We think of them kind of office pen pushers, guys on the walkie-talkie.
Yeah.
But back then, he could have sat back and he could have said, "Hey, you go." And the strike force by the Americans was led not by the General Van Rensselaer, but by the Colonel Van Rensselaer, his brother. So, it was an interesting decision by Isaac Brock. He tried to lead a counterattack on this big battery of artillery, of guns, cannons on top of Queenston Heights, and he got shot himself. So the British won resoundingly. The Americans were repulsed, but Isaac Brock died, and there was never the same level of leadership of the defense than when he was there. And part of what we're talking about with Detroit capturing Michilimackinac Island was the sort of capture of the Michigan Peninsula as it is, sort of, as you look at the map, like it's this sort of big thing. And that was almost promised between Sir Isaac Brock and Tecumseh to sort of be a First Nations confederacy. And Brock was a big time supporter of First Nations ambitions to have its own country and to be autonomous. And there was never a British general after that too that worked so well, with Tecumseh. And of course, Tecumseh himself dies the next year. We can have a whole podcast about Tecumseh and that whole thing too easily. But essentially it was a disaster. All those things, the fall and the winter of 1812 was an absolute unmitigated, embarrassing disaster for the Americans. But they did end up, because Isaac Brock was brash, shooting Isaac Brock. So that's, the Americans came off as embarrassed, but at least they did kill Isaac Brock off. So there, I guess you could look at it that way.
Yeah, they gave themselves a fighting chance by taking away probably the best leadership that the British had in Canada.
Yeah, and the command of it all went to Sheaffe, who was sent as Brock's second in command, and he was not even close to as good. And I think a lot of British minds and military minds were went completely on the defensive after that, until of course 1814, when Napoleon is beaten the first time and they think the war is over in Europe and they send large forces. But between the end of 1812, when Isaac Brock is killed, really to 1814, it's a really defensive by the British. After that, it's no longer aggressive. And Isaac Brock was right. The Americans were an absolute disaster. Probably the British could have gone pretty far if they had been able to get enough resources to make almost an invasion themselves.
Yeah. But once again, thank you very much for joining us here today, Jamie. It's been great talking with you about a topic other than hockey.
Yeah, it's awesome. Thanks for having me, Steve. Really appreciate it.
All right. Well,